Hi, today we're focusing on cultural validity. So we've talked about the ideas, the concepts that we reach towards in thinking about assessment, how to know if an assessment is a good one or not. And so we talked about lots of different types of validity. We looked at face validity, construct validity, empirical validity, for example. And those are the basics that we tend to turn to. That's what I was taught to do. And in this lecture, I'm going to give you, this is kind of an additional idea, and it might be one of the most important ones you take away from this class, and that is cultural validity. So throughout this program, as you're learning and preparing to teach English language learners, there are a lot of topics that we are looking at that if you were to go to any other assessment class for language assessment, probably they're talking about something similar. This is a newer one, and I started including it last year because it is, I think, maybe one of the key ideas, one of the key concepts we have to keep in mind when we're considering assessment. Because all of us are preparing to teach English language learners, and that means all of us are preparing to teach those whose background, home culture is very likely to look a little bit different than mainstream U.S. culture, okay? And why is that an issue? Because most assessments are created by people in little cubicles in the East Coast of the U.S. working for companies like ETS, Pearson, that kind of thing. And they are, more often than not, they are approaching with an understanding of the world from mainstream U.S. culture and having learned to express themselves in English. And there can very likely be a mismatch in that the cultural assumptions that are made by the assessment and by the student taking that assessment. And so if the assessment is not culturally valid, that means that the assumptions would not be shared enough so that the assessment actually is able to show what the student actually understands about English or understands about the knowledge they're trying to express through English, right? And that, back to those ideas from Chomsky, that's a problem with performance versus competence. And once again, what are we after? We are always after the ideal. We are always after finding out what our students really understand, finding out what they can really do with English. Performance is what they did on this particular task on this particular day when they had a cold and didn't feel well, right? So it's not reaching the ideal. It's this particular performance. We want performance to be as close to competence as possible. So we want to get as close to really measuring what they can really do. And if there is a mismatch between the cultural assumptions of those who wrote and are administering the test and those who are taking it, then we're very likely not to get at competence at all, to just get performance. In which case, it's a failed assessment, okay? So that's why all of this matters. Another thing for you to understand is that this is a relatively new term. You'll notice that for your reading for this particular week, you only have readings from one textbook, right? The textbook is pretty dense, pretty difficult to understand. I have taken a chapter and part of the introduction that I think are very readable. So I'm putting them in front of you because you can easily tackle them. You can do that. And the reason that I don't have all the other resources that I normally do is that there isn't a lot else being done. There are people carrying out research right now on cultural validity, but often they haven't even put out their results yet in a paper. And so this is a hot topic. And if we were to pick up a language assessment book, a brand new one, it's very likely that it wouldn't even mention cultural validity yet. So this is one of those topics that you're going to take with you into your future school, program, wherever you end up, And this might be a piece of knowledge that you have, a piece of understanding that you can share with others, okay? So this is another type of validity. So one of the there are some key ideas. What I'm going to do in this really kind of mini lecture is to walk through some key ideas and then highlight some anecdotes, most of which are also in the reading, but I think they'll help you kind of get an overall sense before you get to the reading about what all of this means, about how culture can impact assessment results, okay? So the key idea is assessment is a cultural practice. We may not think of it that way because more often than not, we share so many assumptions with those who write the assessments that it's like seeing the air. It's invisible to us, okay? But assessment is a cultural practice. And these are some of the ways that I think about highlighting what those cultural pieces are. For example, in assessment, there is kind of an invisible question, cultural question, and that is, what is worth knowing, right? And so when you throw that out there, you realize that the person, whether that's the teacher of a class or a professor, or it's someone in an ETS office far away writing an item, that person creating that assessment, they already have a sense of what is worth knowing and what isn't. And that is shaping the decisions that they're making. And right there you can see that there may be disagreement about what's worth knowing. I'm sure you've had the experience of taking an assessment. You show up, maybe it's maybe a history class, and you show up to take an assessment. And what you expect is you expect to be having to explain why certain things happened during a war, or why the group that won, why they were able to overpower the other group, and what the outcomes were, and what are still today, what are the outcomes that are going on. And yet you show up and you were expected to know dates, or you were expected to know cities or countries, things like that. And so at that moment you would have felt a slight cultural validity issue from your own perspective about what's worth knowing, right? So you had a slightly different perspective and maybe even prepared for the assessment in a slightly different way, okay? Another question that helps us think about how assessment is really cultural is what can be expressed, right? What can be expressed? What can we say and what can't we say? And every culture, and it's even hard to talk about this because what can't be said in a culture, it's hard to even talk about that. But one of the examples that we'll look at soon is that in some cultures, and they tend to be very traditional, kind of in developing countries, in some cultures, it's not possible to talk about your thinking. So it's not possible. You can talk about what is, but you can't talk about your thinking about what is, right? So from that language, from that cultural perspective, that cannot be expressed. And so that's kind of one extreme example. And whereas in U.S. culture, we completely embrace in K-12 the idea that not only will students be able to give us the right answer, more important, they'll be able to tell us how they know, right? How did they come to that conclusion? So we really value that. Whereas in other cultures, you don't even express that. It can't be expressed, right? And then how can the information be expressed, right? So it's very typical in the U.S. for us to sit down and take an assessment, and it's got multiple choice items. So last time we looked at multiple choice items, and that's very prevalent, right? And so we are not shocked at that. We expect that that's very likely to happen. We expect there may be true-false kinds of questions, that kind of thing. But I think all of us have experienced at times when you've got a true-false question and you're not sure what to write, because if you think of it this way, it's true, and if you think of it that way, its faults. And so I think it's kind of easy to see how certain cultural perspectives might be even far more reluctant to say something is this or it's this, because they can see more gray area. It's more noticeable from that cultural perspective. And another question, and we'll take a look at this in a moment with the anecdotes, but what is my relationship to the assessor? In some cultures, relationships with people matter so much that you only express certain things to certain people. And that happens in the US too, right? There are things that you would tell your best friend you would not tell your professor. There are things you would tell your best friend you wouldn't tell your mother, and vice versa, right? And so we do a little bit of that, but there's often in some cultures even more a clear sense of what you can say to some people and what you can't say to others. So for example, one thing that we often like to do in assessments in the US is to ask a student to critique something, to point out what are the flaws in this or something like that. For some cultural backgrounds, that might be slightly problematic. There would be kind of a mismatch because the assumption might be, why would I critique something, or why would I critique it to this assessor, right? Who am I to critique this? Who am I to know better than the people who created this idea or law or policy, that kind of thing? And so I think that those questions start to give you an idea of how assessment, even though it may be most of the time invisible to us, there are cultural assumptions that are embedded in it, and every assessment is a cultural practice. And so we have to be really sensitive to the ways that our assessment might be missing the mark with those with more diversity in their cultural backgrounds than is found in typical mainstream US culture. Okay? So 2 ideas I want to highlight. How we think is impacted by our context. And by context, I'm referring to your social context, your cultural context, your lived experience context. And so the way that we think is really shaped by all of those pieces around us, right? So what we think about, how we divide things up into categories, how we value things, what we think is true or false, how we think the world works, right? All impacted by our context. And then, a related idea, our way of thinking then impacts the way we see the world. So the way that we think actually impacts what we see when we look out on the world. And so these are 2 key ideas that are going to come up in the reading that you'll take a look at. And one of the terms that's going to come up in the reading is cognitive acts. And so this is just, I think, a fancy way of saying every action of thinking, right? Every time you stop and try to synthesize something, every time you try to compare and contrast something, every time you try to order something, any action of thinking like that is a cognitive act. And what the reading is going to argue, and I'm arguing to you as well, is that cognitive acts come about because of the context, related to the context, shaped by the context that someone learned to think in, and then those cognitive acts really impact the way then that we see the world. Okay, so big ideas. And so what I want to do with the rest of our time in this mini lecture is to highlight some examples that I think are going to help you see what this all means and how culture and assessment come together. So there's more, you're going to read lots more anecdotes that I'm covering here in the lecture, but these are some that I picked out that I think are really key. And I'm going to add one that I know of as well. So the first one was an assessment that was carried out between children in the US children in Indonesia and children in Mexico who were Mayan, okay? And the children were given, as I remember, they were given cards with pictures of different things. And they were asked to sort them in terms of which things are alive. So there were cards with pictures of people, cards with pictures of animals, plants, and phenomenon like rain and sun, and also objects like rocks, okay? So the children from the US and the children from Indonesia, when they sorted what's alive and what's not alive, they put people, animal, and plants in that category of being alive. And the children from, the Mayan children from Mexico, they added phenomenon. So for them, their sense of the world included the sun, the moon, the rain, natural phenomenon like that. That was alive as well, okay? And the reading kind of makes some connections with culture there. But I think you can see that a question that we think of as just logical, that it's an objective question, everyone's going to have a clear answer to it, and the clear answer is what's alive looks like this, and what is not alive it looks like this. This example starts to problematize that a little bit, right? Because you can see that your cultural background really is likely to impact something like that. Another example of a sorting activity, Chinese children, I think Mandarin speakers, and German children, probably German speakers, they were given a sorting activity in which they were given different pictures of different objects and asked to sort them in whatever way made sense to them. And what the assessors noticed, what the researchers noticed, was that the children from China, so those Mandarin speakers, they sorted by shape. So the categories that they created for putting those cards together were more often than not based on shape. And for those of you who are taking ESLG 488, or you've taken it in the past, you have a clear sense that if you have learned to read in Mandarin, that means you've learned to read in a logographic language, which is shape-based. And you have learned to recognize print by the shape of it. And so it makes sense that children from Germany who have learned to read in an alphabetic language, they're focusing not on shape as much in making sense of print and how they interact visually with the world. So that's another interesting thing as well, something for us to think about, how even the languages that we've learned to read in can even impact the way that we put the world together or separate the world. Okay. A water conservation task, and there are several of these that are mentioned in the chapter that you'll read. Water conservation task, what this means is not what it sounds like. What it sounds like is getting people to save water. What it really is you start out with 2 beakers of water, and they have equal amounts in them. Both beakers are the same. And then you take one of the beakers of water and you pour it into another, and this one is very, very skinny and tall so that the water crawls up. It reaches a higher level on that beaker. And then to ask people which beaker has more water. Of course, the correct answer, right, is that there is no difference because they've seen that these amounts of water were the same. If you pour this one into a different beaker, it's going to be the same amount of water, right? So research was carried out with children and young adults from literate cultures, literate societies. So in other words, people read and write and probably have some access to formal schooling, and those who did not. So maybe even the first language isn't written. Most people haven't had access to school, for example. And what they noticed was that those who were from the non-literate societies were far more likely to say that the beaker that was tall and thin had more water. So they noticed this. But here's one of the pieces that anecdote highlights. The researchers changed the prompt a little bit, and they asked people to explain, why do you think it has more water? And once people were able to explain, it became clear that for them, in their cultural perspective, the correct answer to say is to say more, but they really understood it was the same amount of water. But for them to express in their language, in their culture, an answer to that question, they needed to indicate there was more. So what's the takeaway on that? That we really have to think about perhaps building in opportunities to ask people why they think, or to give a way for them to talk back to the assessment, to see if perhaps the assessment is not capturing all of competence of what people know, what they can do. Okay? So another example that I want to talk about comes from Senegal, and I kind of mentioned this earlier. And this example that you'll read about is kids in Senegal, and they were asked questions about, what is true, and they were able to answer those. But when they were asked, why do you think that, they did not answer. Because, as it was discovered, in that particular cultural group, there's the world and what's true, and my thinking can't be anything but what is true. And so those two things cannot be separated. So the assessor was attempting to separate those, but for that particular cultural background, they could not be separated. Okay. So there was no distinction between reality and my thinking about reality. Okay. Another example, and this one comes to us from women in Mexico from, I'm not sure if I'm saying the name of the group correctly, but Zina Cantico. It's probably Zina Canteco now that I think about it. And in this particular cultural group, people weave, especially the women, weave very, very complex patterns. And as they do so, they have to be doing really complex math to make sure that they've got the right number of rows in the right number of colors, and that they've got the right amount of thread ready to do that weaving. And so researchers wanted to know, because they're doing this really high-level mathematics, does that apply? I mean, are they able to apply that to patterns that are not part of their tradition? Can they apply it to something new, in other words? Are they able to take that information and abstractly apply it to a pattern that they haven't encountered before? And what the researchers found was that they were actually not able to do that. And so if you stuck with the patterns that the women knew and you worked with the math around those, they were able to carry that out and talk about it, but they weren't able to do that with patterns that were unfamiliar. Another example is with giving women, and I forget which country this is in, giving women problems to solve, and two different expressions of the problem. One expressed in a real life kind of situation. You could buy this or you could buy this, which is the better deal? And of course you have to think about the amount. Each one is a different amount, different price, and there might be some other things that impact it in terms of quality. And the second version of the problem was the same thing, but not as a real world problem, but actually just as straight math, like division, multiplication, subtraction, that kind of thing. And so what they found with that group of women is that they could easily tackle the math problem when it was a real world situation that they had dealt with and probably did every day. But when it was just the abstract mathematical problem, they were not able to tackle that. So it's one of those things where it gets us thinking about the shape of the problem, right, that we're putting in front of students, and kind of thinking about the role with their shared reality, their own experience of the world, thinking about that. So I hope that some of those examples kind of got you thinking about the way culture can impact the answers, the responses that students give. I want to give a couple of more examples. One comes from a story that was shared with me from someone who is a water engineer. And she was doing research in a country in Central America. I think it's El Salvador, but I'm not entirely sure. And the part of the country that she was in, the adults had not attended any formal schooling and had not learned to read and write in Spanish. And I think that some of the adults in the community were actually not Spanish speakers, but they spoke an indigenous language. And so they had not learned to read and write in that language either. So she was carrying out a water conservation project, and so she had kind of a protocol that she created for herself, all these steps that she was going to take before she left El Salvador to figure out a plan for how the community could best kind of guard and care for and use their water. And one of the steps before she got to El Salvador that she had written was that she would take paper and pencil to each of the families that lived in this community and ask them to draw a map of their property and where the water was. And before she went, she really thought of this as just a matter of providing the paper, providing the pencil, and making sure to visit all the communities, tell them what to do, and then go back and collect those and make sure to label which family and which plot that it came from. So before she went to El Salvador, that's what she thought her work was. When she went back and she collected those maps about what people's visions of their property and the water on their property were, she said that what people had created had probably to your eye, to my eye, certainly to her eye, had no relationship to their property at all. So for example, if their property was a rectangle, what they had drawn on their paper might be something like this, right? And if the water was mostly in this area, that really had no relationship to where they had placed it on their map of their property. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because I think it's a really good reminder of how schooled our vision is, how literate our vision is, how we have learned since we were preschoolers how to draw a map of something. Automatically, when we think map, we think in terms as if we're in a helicopter looking down, or we're in an airplane looking down, right? And that is a very specific cultural vision. And so what she was seeing people who had probably never seen a map in their lives. They'd never seen their property from up in the sky. And also, they had not been schooled on what are the typical shapes that we use, right? We typically use rectangles or squares or circles. So there are certain shapes that we reach for, some abstract shapes. And so they were missing all of those pieces. And so what they gave her, I'm sure very much in their minds, was their property and their water. But it didn't match up with what she was expecting, because she had a very specific cultural vision of what that map would look like. So she couldn't use them at all, but she did use them to kind of help make sense of how that community thought. Okay, so one more example I want to share with you. as I've been learning, as you probably know, I on a regular basis go to Nicaragua, and I try to learn as much as I can about not just the schooling that I see happen when I visit classrooms, when I visit English classrooms, but the schooling that happens at home. How are children taught? And for so many children, most kids don't go on to sixth grade. And the biggest dropout rate is between first and second grade. So most learning happens informally. That really interests me. I want to understand how that happens. I have this idea that I can connect that with the learning that happens in the classroom. So that's all a long way of saying that one of the things I have done is to try to learn about how children learn in Nicaragua at home. And there's not a lot written. But if I set my sights out and I start to look at Central America, sorry, I'm suddenly really dry, then I've been able to gather a little more information. And there's been quite a bit written about indigenous groups in Central America, and there are indigenous groups, many, in Nicaragua, and so I've been able to draw upon some of those articles and those texts to understand a little bit. And there's one anecdote I want to offer to you that a researcher who spent a year with a community, she described. And so she wanted to understand, how do little girls, because it's little girls